A poor black boy accidentally comes across an old homeless man rummaging through a trash can for food, weak and suffering from memory loss. Instead of walking away, he decides to help, offering him a meal and bringing him home. His family welcomes the old man with kindness, giving him food and a place to sleep. In return, the man helps the boy by working unpaid at the small diner where the boy has a job. What the boy doesn't realize is that the man he rescued isn't just some helpless old man, he's someone who will change his family's life forever. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of grilled food and fresh bread from the local bakeries lining the street. The neon sign of Manny's Diner buzzed softly above Ethan Parker's head as he pushed open the back door, stepping into the dimly lit alleyway behind the small restaurant. His shift had just ended, and his arms ached from hours of scrubbing tables, refilling coffee cups, and carrying heavy trays of greasy food. The day had been long, like every other day, and he still had to walk home to the tiny apartment he shared with his mother. As he dragged a heavy garbage bag toward the dumpster, something caught his eye. A figure sat slumped near the alley's entrance, half hidden in the shadows. At first, Ethan thought it was just another pile of discarded blankets, but then he saw movement, a slow, shivering huddle. The figure was an old man, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his thin, bony hands fumbling through a torn plastic bag filled with scraps. His gray beard was tangled, his clothes stained and ragged. He looked fragile, as if a strong gust of wind might knock him over. Ethan hesitated, gripping the trash bag tighter. He had seen homeless people around town before, lingering near bus stops or curled up on benches at the park, but he had never stopped to speak to one. He knew better than to get involved. His mother always said they couldn't afford to help others when they could barely keep their own electricity on. Still, something about the old man made Ethan pause. Maybe it was the way his fingers trembled as he picked up a stale crust of bread from the ground, or the vacant look in his pale blue eyes, as if he wasn't really there, lost in a fog of confusion. "Hey, sir?" Ethan's voice came out awkward, uncertain. The man didn't react at first, just kept staring at the piece of bread in his hand. Ethan cleared his throat and took a cautious step closer. "Are you okay?" This time the man looked up, blinking as if he had just noticed Ethan standing there. His expression was distant, unfocused, like he was trying to place where he was. Then, after a long silence, he nodded slowly but said nothing. Ethan glanced back toward the diner. He wasn't supposed to take food without paying for it, but he also knew that Manny, the owner, wouldn't notice if something went missing. They threw out leftover food at the end of the night anyway. "Hold on," Ethan muttered before turning and disappearing back inside the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a steaming styrofoam container in his hands. It wasn't much, just a leftover burger and some fries, but it was hot, and it was more than the man had. He crouched down and held it out. "Here, you should eat." The old man stared at the food for a long moment, as if unsure whether it was real. Then, with slow, hesitant movements, he reached out and took it. His fingers brushed against Ethan's, and for the first time, Ethan realized how cold the man's hands were, how frail. "Thank you," the man murmured, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Ethan nodded, standing back up and stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. He should probably just leave. His mom would be waiting, and she hated when he stayed out late. But as he watched the old man take a careful bite of the burger, chewing slowly like someone who hadn't eaten in days, he found himself unable to walk away. "What's your name?" he asked, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The man hesitated, his brows furrowing as if the question confused him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if trying to find the answer somewhere deep in his mind. I don't remember," he finally admitted, looking down at the food in his lap. "I think Henry." Ethan frowned. "You think?" The old man, Henry, let out a weary sigh. "It comes and goes. Some days I know things. Other days it's like waking up in a place I don't recognize." He touched his forehead, fingers grazing a faint scar hidden beneath his unkempt hair. "There was an accident, I think. I hit my head. After that I started getting lost." Ethan swallowed hard. He had heard about people like this, those who lost their memories from head trauma. He had never met one before, but it made sense. The way Henry seemed lost in his own mind, the way he wandered without direction, it all added up. "You don't have anyone looking for you?" Ethan asked. Henry shook his head, but something about the gesture felt uncertain, as if he weren't entirely sure of the answer himself. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he stepped into this alley, but it certainly wasn't this. A man with no home, no memory, no idea where he belonged. He should leave. He should say good night, walk away, and forget about Henry because it wasn't his problem. But as he turned toward the street, ready to start the long walk home, he heard the sound of rustling fabric. He glanced back and saw Henry struggling to wrap the thin blanket tighter around himself, his fingers still shaking from the cold. Ethan looked down at the bag of leftover food in his hands, the extra scraps he had taken from the diner. He sighed. "Come with me," he said. Henry blinked up at him, confused. "What?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, my mom won't mind if you crash on the couch for the night. It's not much, but it's warm, and you won't have to sleep out here." For a long time, Henry just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether he could trust this strange boy who had suddenly appeared in his life. Then, slowly, he nodded. Ethan turned and started walking, and this time Henry followed. Ethan led the way down the quiet, dimly lit streets, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn-out jacket. The night air was colder than he had expected, a sharp contrast to the lingering warmth of the diner's kitchen. Behind him, Henry followed in slow, uncertain steps, his frail body hunched forward, as if the weight of the world rested on his thin shoulders. The only sounds were the rhythmic scuffing of Ethan's sneakers against the pavement and the occasional sniffle from Henry, who shivered under his tattered coat. Ethan glanced back now and then, checking to make sure the old man was still behind him. It was strange. Just an hour ago, Henry had been nothing more than another forgotten soul in the city's shadows. Now, Ethan felt responsible for him, as if leading him home was the only right thing to do. He wasn't sure how his mom would react, though. She had always been kind, but kindness didn't pay the rent. They barely had enough for themselves, and now he was bringing home a stranger with no name, no past, and no future. By the time they reached the small, run-down apartment complex, Ethan could already see the warm glow of the kitchen light spilling through the thin curtains of their living room window. He hesitated at the front door, his fingers tightening around the doorknob. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe his mom would tell Henry to leave, and then Ethan would have to send him back out into the cold, pretending it didn't make his stomach twist. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The scent of canned soup and stale bread filled the air, a humble but familiar comfort. His mother, Sarah Parker, stood at the kitchen counter, her back turned as she stirred a pot on the stove. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose ponytail, and exhaustion was evident in the way her shoulders slumped. She worked long hours as a cleaner and still came home to cook for them every night. She turned at the sound of the door creaking open, her brown eyes immediately narrowing when she saw Ethan standing there with an unfamiliar man beside him. For a brief moment, there was only silence. Then, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she said slowly, her gaze shifting from her son to the frail man behind him. "Who is this?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her question settle heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that you found a lost man digging through the trash and decided to bring him home like a stray dog? "His name's Henry," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter than he had intended. He doesn't have anywhere to go." Sarah studied Henry, taking in his sunken cheeks, the way his hands trembled slightly, even though they were inside now. Her lips pressed together, not in anger but in deep thought. She had always been good at reading people, and what she saw in Henry must have been enough, because after a long moment she simply sighed. "I made extra soup," she said, turning back toward the kitchen. "Come in. Sit down." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gestured for Henry to follow, and the old man stepped inside hesitantly, as if afraid the invitation might be revoked at any second. He sat carefully at the small, wobbly dining table while Sarah ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of him. Henry stared at it for a long time, as if the simple act of someone giving him food was something foreign, something he hadn't experienced in a long while. Then, slowly, he picked up the spoon and took a cautious sip. His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, a quiet sigh escaping his lips, and for the first time that night, Ethan saw something other than confusion in the old man's expression. He saw relief. Sarah pulled out a chair across from him, her sharp gaze softening just a little. "Do you have family?" she asked. Henry hesitated, lowering the spoon back into the bowl. His eyes darted to Ethan, then back to Sarah, as if searching for an answer that refused to come. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah frowned but didn't press. She simply nodded and reached for the bread on the counter, breaking off a piece and placing it next to his soup. "You can stay here tonight," she said, not unkindly. "We don't have much, but at least it's warm." Henry's lips parted slightly, his brows knitting together in an expression that Ethan couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Shock? Maybe both. He nodded stiffly and returned his focus to the meal in front of him, eating slowly, savoring every bite as if it might be his last. Ethan watched, his mind still trying to process everything. He had expected his mother to argue, to tell him that they couldn't afford to take in another mouth to feed. But she had looked at Henry and made the same decision Ethan had in the alleyway, that this was simply the right thing to do. Later that night, Ethan lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the dim glow of the streetlights cast shifting shadows across the room. Henry was curled up under an old blanket in the corner, breathing softly, the exhaustion of the day finally overtaking him. His presence in their home felt strange but not unwelcome, like a missing puzzle piece that had suddenly appeared, even if they didn't know where it fit yet. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest, the feeling that somehow bringing Henry home was going to change everything. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp pavement and the distant aroma of fresh coffee from a cafe down the street. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he stepped out of the apartment, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the other weighed down by the familiar burden of another long day ahead. The sun had barely risen, casting a muted glow over the quiet streets, and most of the neighborhood was still asleep. Behind him, Henry shuffled through the doorway, his thin hands clutching the front of his oversized coat. His movements were hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he was supposed to follow or stay behind. But when Ethan glanced back at him and gave a small nod, the old man stepped fully outside, pulling the door shut with a quiet click. Sarah had left early for work, and there was no one else at home, no warm space to linger in. So Henry followed Ethan, just as he had the night before. Ethan wasn't sure how long Henry planned to stay, or if he even had a plan at all. The old man didn't seem like he belonged anywhere, like he had been drifting so long that the idea of staying put felt foreign to him. But something about the way he moved now, more alert than the night before, more present, told Ethan that at least for today, Henry had chosen to follow him. They walked in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps the only noise between them. Ethan could feel Henry's presence just a step behind him, lingering but never intruding, like a ghost tethered to his path. He wondered if this was what Henry had been doing for months, just following people, hoping someone would lead him home, even if he no longer knew where that was. When they reached Manny's diner, Ethan hesitated at the door. He hadn't exactly thought this through. He was used to walking in, slipping on his apron, and getting to work. But now, with Henry beside him, everything felt different. Was Manny going to be okay with this? Was he even allowed to bring someone in like this? The last thing Ethan needed was to lose his job over something that wasn't even his problem to begin with. He turned to Henry, rubbing the back of his neck. You can wait outside if you want. I'll bring you something to eat when I get a break." Henry didn't respond right away. His pale blue eyes flickered toward the diner's windows, catching glimpses of customers already sitting inside, the glow of warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. He shifted on his feet, pressing his hands deeper into his coat pockets. "I can help," Henry said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan frowned. "What?" Henry straightened slightly, though the weight of his worn-out body still made him look small. "I can help," he repeated. "I used to work. I think I did. I don't remember what, but I know I did something." He looked toward the diner again, something flickering in his expression, determination, maybe, or just the simple desire to belong somewhere, even for a little while. "I don't want to just sit out here." Ethan wasn't sure what to say. The idea of Henry working, even in small ways, felt odd. The man barely seemed strong enough to stand for long periods, let alone carry trays or wipe down tables. But at the same time, something about his words made sense. He didn't want to just be a stray waiting for scraps. Before Ethan could decide, the door swung open and Manny, the diner's owner, stepped outside, rubbing his hands together against the cold. He was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and a permanently tired expression. He took one look at Henry, then turned his gaze to Ethan, his thick brows pulling together. "You picking up strays now, Parker?" he asked, his voice gruff but not entirely unkind. Ethan tensed. No, I mean, this is Henry. He doesn't really have anywhere to go, so I." Manny held up a hand, cutting him off. He studied Henry for a moment, his eyes sharp but unreadable. Henry, to his credit, didn't look away. He simply stood there, steady despite the way his fingers trembled slightly from the cold. Manny exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn bleeding hearts," he muttered, then jerked his chin toward the diner. "Come on in, old man. You can help clean tables. Just don't break anything." Henry blinked, his lips parting slightly, as if he hadn't expected that response. Ethan was equally surprised, his mouth hanging open for a second before he caught himself. "Wait, really?" Manny grunted. "Not like I'm paying him. I've had worse workers." Henry nodded, his hands tightening into weak fists at his sides, as if bracing himself for something unfamiliar yet desperately wanted. He followed Manny inside without hesitation, and Ethan quickly trailed after them, still processing what had just happened. Inside, the diner was already coming to life. The scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, the low hum of conversation blending with the occasional clatter of plates. Regular customers occupied the booths, and the sound of an old jukebox played softly from the corner. It was a small, simple place, but to Henry it must have felt like stepping into another world. Manny tossed Ethan his apron and gestured toward Henry. "Give him something easy to do. Wipe down tables, take out trash. If he gets in the way, he's gone." Ethan nodded, still caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. He turned to Henry, who was looking around the diner with a quiet sort of awe. For the first time since they had met, he didn't seem lost. He had purpose, even if it was just for today. "Come on," Ethan said, handing him a rag. "I'll show you what to do." Henry took it without hesitation. His grip was weak, but there was something steady in his touch. And so, for the first time in what felt like forever, Henry Thompson had a job. The day passed in a strange, almost surreal blur. Ethan found himself constantly glancing toward Henry, half expecting the old man to collapse from exhaustion or forget where he was and wander out the door. But somehow, against all odds, Henry kept up. He moved slowly, carefully wiping down tables with the same quiet focus as someone handling fragile glass. His fingers still trembled, his steps were still unsteady, but he never once stopped. He never once complained. He did what he could, and when Ethan caught Manny watching from behind the counter, the older man just grunted and muttered, "I've seen worse." At first, customers barely noticed Henry. To them, he was just another worker, another faceless person bussing tables in the background. But as the hours passed, people started to pay attention. Some whispered, some stared. A few regulars, those who came in every morning like clockwork, recognized him. "Hey," one older man in a plaid jacket murmured as Henry shuffled past. His brow furrowed, lips pressing together like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Aren't you?" Henry paused mid-step, turning to look at the man. His face twitched slightly, something like recognition flickering through his clouded gaze. But just as quickly it was gone. He shook his head, muttering a quiet, "I don't know." The customer hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but eventually let it go, turning back to his coffee. Ethan saw it all happen. He saw how Henry tried to remember, how something in him struggled just beneath the surface, like a door locked tight from the inside. The realization settled in Ethan's chest like a weight. Henry wasn't just some random homeless man. He had been someone once, someone people had known, someone who had mattered. And then, near the end of Ethan's shift, it happened. It started when Ethan was taking out the trash, stepping into the alley behind the diner. The sun had already begun to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. As he dragged the garbage bags toward the dumpster, his foot hit something. He frowned, looking down. A flyer. It was slightly crumpled, edges damp from where it had been caught in a puddle, but the image printed on it was still clear. A black and white photo of a man, Henry. The text beneath it read, "Missing, Henry Thompson. Last seen 3 months ago. If found, please contact." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He snatched the flyer up, his pulse hammering in his ears as he scanned the address at the bottom. It wasn't some homeless shelter or government office. It was an actual home, a real address. Henry had a family. His fingers tightened around the paper as he turned, shoving open the back door and stepping into the diner, his heart beat loud in his ears. Henry was still there, wiping down a table near the window. Ethan barely noticed the customers, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of the jukebox. He crossed the diner in a few hurried steps, gripping the flyer so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Henry," he said, his voice lower than he intended, laced with urgency. The old man looked up, blinking in surprise. "Him?" Ethan hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to say it. He could feel Manny watching from behind the counter, customers glancing up from their meals. But none of that mattered. He held out the flyer. "I found this outside." Henry frowned, his eyes shifting toward the paper in Ethan's hands. For a moment he didn't react. Then, slowly, he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the edges as he brought it closer to his face. And then, a sharp intake of breath. A tremor passed through Henry's entire body. His jaw clenched, his fingers pressing into the paper so tightly it crinkled beneath his grip. His eyes widened, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, he looked fully awake. "I know this place," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. His free hand rose to his temple, pressing hard like he was trying to force something back into place. This is my home." The entire diner felt silent. Even Manny, who usually had something snarky to say, just stood behind the counter, his arms folded, watching. Ethan nodded slowly, his throat dry. "I think so." Henry's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling unevenly. He looked back at the flyer, his thumb running over the printed address, his lips moving like he was trying to form words but couldn't. Then, his head jerked up, eyes locking onto Ethan's. "We have to go," he said. His voice was firm, desperate, carrying more strength than Ethan had ever heard from him. "Take me there, now." Ethan barely had time to process before Henry moved, pushing away from the table, stepping toward the door with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Ethan swallowed, glancing once at Manny, half expecting the man to tell him to get back to work. But instead, Manny just waved a hand, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Go, kid. Take him home." Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed his jacket, shoved open the door, and followed Henry out into the street. Ethan hurried to keep up as Henry moved down the sidewalk, gripping the missing person flyer like a lifeline. His pace was unsteady, his steps uneven, but there was something different in the way he walked now, something with purpose, something that hadn't been there before. The dazed, wandering man Ethan had met in the alley felt like a ghost compared to the Henry beside him now. He was awake, and he was desperate to go home. The address on the flyer was further than Ethan had expected, too far to walk without losing half the night, so he made a split-second decision. He grabbed Henry's arm and steered him toward the nearest bus stop. Henry flinched at the sudden movement, his body tensing. But when he saw Ethan pulling out a few crumpled bills from his pocket, realization flickered in his eyes, and he nodded in understanding. The bus ride was quiet, but charged with something unspoken. Henry sat beside Ethan, his hands gripping the flyer so tightly it threatened to rip at the edges. His fingers twitched against the paper, his lips moving slightly, as if testing the name printed on it. Every so often, he would glance out the window, his breath coming fast, shallow. Ethan could feel the war raging inside him, the pieces of memory trying to force themselves back together. It was like watching someone chase a dream they had just woken from, close enough to feel it, but never quite able to hold on to it. When the bus finally pulled up to the stop near the address, Henry shot to his feet before the doors had even fully opened. Ethan barely had time to follow as the old man stepped out onto the pavement, his wide eyes scanning the quiet suburban street. The houses here were nothing like the cramped apartment Ethan lived in. They were big, with neatly trimmed lawns and driveways lined with expensive cars. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where families sat down for dinner together and didn't have to worry about things like overdue rent or working double shifts. And then Henry froze. His eyes locked onto a house at the end of the block, a large white two-story home with dark shutters and a porch light glowing in the evening dim. His breath hitched, his entire body going rigid. "That's it," Henry whispered. His voice was so soft Ethan barely heard it. Then, louder, more certain, "That's my home." Before Ethan could react, Henry moved, stumbling forward like a man who had just found the edge of a cliff but couldn't stop himself from falling. Ethan hesitated only a second before following. His heart pounded as Henry stepped up to the porch, his shaking hand hovering inches from the doorbell. His fingers twitched, curled into a weak fist, then pressed the button. The chime rang out, echoing through the quiet evening air. For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then, footsteps. The door swung open, and a man stood there. He was in his early 30s, tall, with sharp features, and dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he had just run his hands through it. His crisp dress shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. But it wasn't his appearance that mattered, it was his eyes. Because the second he saw Henry standing there, his entire expression shattered. "Dad?" The word was barely a breath, hoarse and disbelieving. Henry staggered back, like the name had struck him. His lips parted, and for a split second, everything crashed into place. "William." Ethan watched as a storm of emotions passed over the younger man's face, shock, relief, disbelief, then something deeper, something raw. William took a step forward and Henry broke. His legs buckled, his breath hitched, and suddenly he was falling. But William caught him. The son caught his father before he could hit the ground, arms wrapping around him, holding him up, holding him together. And then, just like that, Henry collapsed into him, sobbing. It wasn't a quiet kind of crying. It was the kind that tore through a person, the kind that came from months, maybe years of being lost, alone, forgotten. Henry gripped William's shirt, knuckles white, his entire body trembling as memories flooded back in. And William, who had spent 3 months searching, waiting, hoping, held on to him like he was afraid to let go again. Ethan looked away, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a moment too private, too sacred for him to witness. His throat felt tight, something he couldn't explain pressing hard against his chest. He had thought finding Henry's family would feel like an ending, like checking off the last step in a long, exhausting task. But now, standing on this porch, watching a father and son break apart and piece themselves back together again, it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like something much bigger. Henry pulled back just enough to look up at his son, his breath still uneven, his face lined with exhaustion but lighter than Ethan had ever seen it. He started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I don't remember everything." William gripped his shoulders, his expression firm but kind. "That's okay," he said. "You're home now." And that was all that mattered. Ethan stepped away from the porch, his feet moving before his mind could fully process what had just happened. Behind him, Henry and William clung to each other, father and son reunited after months of searching, of waiting, of not knowing. It was everything Ethan had hoped for, everything he had wanted when he found that flyer. Yet now, standing in the quiet of the dimly lit street, he felt strangely out of place. This wasn't his moment to witness. So he turned and walked away. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't linger for explanations. The weight that had settled in his chest over the past week, the responsibility of Henry's well-being, the quiet worry that the old man would never find his way back, had lifted. There was nothing left for Ethan to do. Henry had his family now, and that was enough. The walk home felt lighter than usual, as if the burden he had been carrying had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the cool night air and the faint hum of distant traffic. By the time he reached the apartment, the scent of something warm filled the space, a simple meal, nothing fancy but comforting in its familiarity. Sarah was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, her tired face softening when she turned and saw him. "You're late," she said, but there was no real reprimand in her voice, only quiet curiosity. Then she frowned slightly, noticing something missing. "Where's Henry?" Ethan smiled, a rare, genuine kind of smile that even surprised him. He dropped his bag onto the worn-out couch, stretching his sore arms. He found his way home. Sarah turned fully now, setting the spoon down as she studied him. The exhaustion that had weighed on Ethan for the past week, the long shifts, the worry, the uncertainty, seemed to have faded. There was something different in him, something lighter. Her lips curved upward, and she nodded. Good. That night, for the first time in a long while, dinner felt different. There was no stress hanging over them like an unwanted guest, no uneasy silence filled with unspoken worries. They ate together, and it wasn't just eating, it was enjoying. Even the dim light in their small apartment seemed warmer somehow. Ethan went to bed without the usual weight pressing on his chest. For once, he let himself sleep without worrying about what tomorrow would bring. The next day started just like any other. Ethan arrived at Manny's diner at his usual time, slipping into his routine with practiced ease, wiping down tables, taking orders, refilling coffee cups. The customers were the same, the routine was the same. Everything should have felt normal. But it wasn't. Because just as the morning rush began to settle, the door chime jingled, and when Ethan glanced up from behind the counter, his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway, looking nothing like the frail, disoriented man from just days ago, was Henry Thompson. His clothes were clean, a neatly pressed button-down replacing the tattered coat he had once clung to. His hair, now combed back, revealed the faint scar along his temple, a mark of the past he had struggled to remember. And beside him, standing tall in a fitted suit that looked far too expensive for this tiny diner, was William. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Henry was the first to react. His face broke into a warm, relieved smile, the kind that made the last few days feel worth it. He stepped forward before Ethan could even find his voice, his hands reaching out, not with hesitation, but with certainty. And then, to Ethan's complete and utter shock, Henry pulled him into a hug. Ethan stiffened at first. He wasn't used to this affection, gratitude, recognition. But Henry's grip was firm, genuine, filled with something unspoken but deeply understood. And slowly, cautiously, Ethan relaxed. When Henry pulled away, there was a shine in his eyes, something deep, something real. "You saved me," he said simply, his voice steady in a way it had never been before. "You didn't have to, but you did." Ethan swallowed, unsure of what to say, so he just shrugged. "You followed me first." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "That might be true," he admitted. Then, stepping aside, he gestured toward William, who had been watching silently, his sharp gaze filled with something unreadable. "My son," Henry said with quiet pride, as if the words themselves were a miracle. "He wanted to meet you properly." William extended a hand, and when Ethan shook it, he felt the strength behind it. Not just physical, but something deeper, something that carried meaning. "You didn't just help my father," William said, his voice calm, controlled, but genuine. "You gave him back to me. I don't think there's anything in the world that could repay that." Ethan didn't know how to respond to something like that. He wasn't used to being thanked. Not like this. But William wasn't finished. "We'd like to speak with your mother," he continued, glancing around the diner. "If she's home, we'd love to visit." Ethan blinked, thrown off. "My mom?" Henry nodded. "If she raised you to be this way, then I think we owe her a thank you too." Ethan hesitated, unsure of whether this was really happening, but one look at Henry's expression told him it was real. So, after a moment, he nodded. The drive back home was quiet, filled with an air of anticipation Ethan didn't quite know how to process. When they reached his apartment, he stepped inside first, the familiar scent of home greeting him. Sarah was at the kitchen table, sorting through unpaid bills, her face creased with the kind of tiredness that never fully went away. She looked up when Ethan walked in, but before she could speak, Henry and William followed him inside. Sarah froze. Her eyes flicked between the well-dressed man and the familiar old one, recognition dawning in slow waves. She stood, wiping her hands on her jeans, her voice cautious. "You must be Henry." Henry smiled. "And you must be Sarah." She looked at Ethan, confusion flashing across her face. "What's going on?" Ethan opened his mouth, but William stepped forward first. "My name is William Thompson," he said smoothly, offering his hand. "Your son saved my father's life. We wanted to return the favor. Sarah's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her features. She shook William's hand, her eyes narrowing slightly. Return the favor? William glanced around the apartment, his sharp gaze taking in everything: the chipped paint, the stack of overdue notices, the faint flicker of the old kitchen light that would probably go out soon. Then, his expression softened. My company has a few open positions, he said casually. I'd love to offer you one. Something stable with benefits. Sarah's eyes widened, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. She looked at Ethan, then back at William, as if trying to determine whether this was real. William smiled. And as for Ethan, we'd like to make sure he never has to worry about school again. Ethan's stomach dropped. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Sarah's hand covered her mouth, emotion flickering in her eyes, relief, disbelief, gratitude all at once. And just like that, everything changed. Henry squeezed Ethan's shoulder gently, his voice warm. You helped me find my way home, he said. Now it's our turn to help you. And this time, Ethan let them. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.